There's a big difference from not being aware to being aware.
How is that progress? Like, how are we going to make any changes? So, according to me, I feel like we need to be more gentle about it and supportive about it. We're so aware of these things that it's also very difficult to pull away from.
You do certain things. Earlier, you wouldn't just think about it. It would go weeks or months without you understanding. Now, the next minute you're aware. So awareness is maybe sometimes pointless, but I feel it's really helpful. It's so boring, right? If you only sound angry all the time, no one wants to talk to you. Whether it's your your wife or your kid, everyone's like, you just write them off going, that guy's just angry and bitter all the time. But if you can appreciate and kind of work yourself away from, or rather take a step back and listen to what you sound like, it allows for an opportunity where you can say, okay, this was my default setting because I was spoken to as a kid like this by my parents, or I heard them speak like this. You're able to say, okay, this was the tone, this could be optional tones that I use. It gives you so many more different ways to kind of work with. And the biggest thing is, how do you speak to yourself? Welcome to the podcast. Welcome to another episode. Lovely to have you with us and partaking in this conversation that we attempt to solve the quandaries of life. It's poking my arm. Do you have sensitive skin?
Sunday.
Okay. Cool. You want to get started?
What are we talking about?
You know, what I found in many years of being on stage, whether it's with stand-up especially, also with listening to good orators, and also in theater, right? The reason I'm building up to this is because it's what we want to talk about today, is what you say isn't as important as how you say it. Just now, I just ate up 4 words. Let me rephrase that. What you say isn't as important as how you say it. Because you can have some of the best material or the best lines, but if you don't say it well, it's not received with the impact that it needs to be received, right? So I've been
Material
thinking,
in the sense like comedy
content,
material, or
like your jokes, or it could be your speech. Like
it
you
could
can
be
have,
regular conversation as
right. So
well.
that's where I started out thinking about how to say things, right? The power of delivery. But little do we think about that in our everyday life, how our words are received by people. Um, so when it's a performance, obviously, because you have to be seen in a certain light as a good performer, you give attention to the way you speak. But it's so important, I've realized, in personal relationships as well, because when you're out in public, yeah, you want to be viewed as, oh, he speaks so politely, he speaks so well, or he's so well put together, or she is well, speaking from my point of view. Um, but many times you've told me that I come across as very aggressive sounding, or I sound condescending, or I sound even kind of derogatory in some ways when I speak to you, or now with Shasa, you're like, what's your tone? What's your tone, right? So where did that come from for you?
For me, I mean, I didn't even think it was such a important thing to be aware of until, I mean, after a few years, we realized, at least I realized, that that was what was bothering me. Earlier, I would just get irritated with you for something, like something that you said, but was not aware that tone was what was bothering me. So I would initially not say certain things to you, knowing the reaction or the tone it would come with, because I didn't want to hear those things. I think it's as simple as, like, if I ask you to do something, like stay in bed with Shasa till I go have a coffee and come back, it's almost as if you get defensive or like angry and say, no, but I have to use the loo. Or, like, it's not like, no, can you sit instead? Like, I need to use the loo, so can you sit instead, or should we put on the monitor or something like that? But it's more like, no, like, I need to use the loo. So then initially, so this is just like off late recently, but I'm saying, like, earlier on I didn't even realize that it was just the tone. So I think after we started talking about it, we realized that that was what it was, and then we started being more observant and conscious of that tone. And now it's all now you catch yourself doing that. Like it's obviously it's not something that will change overnight, but I've noticed you like if I give it a few seconds, you're like, okay, sorry, like that was the tone.
It's a weird thing, right? Because many of us go our entire lives almost without listening to what we sound like, unless, of course, we're recorded for a podcast or an interview, and then we're like, "Oh my God, this is what I sound. I hate how I sound." But I think this is something which is important to me because, of course, in context of now Shasa being in the picture, I want to be um, aware of what I sound like to her, because there needs to be a distinction between, okay, if there is that situation where she needs to know that that is not okay because it's either dangerous for her or it's something she needs to realize that she shouldn't do, the tone should be different from when she wakes up in the morning or when she's playing with me or when she's talking to me. Because if the tone across the board is, I won't say rude, but if it's the same, where your kind voice, your fatherly voice, your protective voice, your happy voice, everything sounds angry, then they're not able to distinguish what you're trying to say to them. And for the longest time, I never thought that I sounded a certain way, in your opinion, rude or derogatory or aggressive or
Defensive.
defensive. But I think once I started paying attention, as you said, it's not easy to undo, because then you're consciously making an effort to sound polite or considerate. But the default tone is almost like, as you said, like when you say something like, "Hey, um, can you put away the trash?" I'm like, "Why should I do it?" Right?
Yeah.
It's knee jerk.
But wait a minute. When it's anybody else other than family, right? Like if it's like anybody else, the tone, even if you're pissed off with somebody,
Yeah.
the tone is extra sweet and extra nice, like it's sugar coated.
Why do we do that? Why do we perform, or rather protect uh, strangers from what we actually want to sound like, and kind of take it,
Yeah. So
lay it bare for people who we're supposed to, I mean, not supposed, but we spend the most time with.
I think we generally take for granted whoever's close to us. That's for sure, like one
I
part
think
of it.
that's in fact, I think in a way, someone would also say, "Who that's the true sign of being close with someone." But besides that, it's taking for granted is one way. I think the other thing is also that, yeah, that you're so comfortable that you're not worried about being judged. But I think beyond that, it's also these situations with the closest people that shape the way you speak. And in many ways, it's a loop. See, when you come into my situation at home, whether it's with my folks and me or my sister and me, you are hyper aware
Yeah.
of what we sound like.
Even though it's been
Because-
so many years.
Yeah. And I'm now aware when I come into your like parents' house and there's an evening where all of us are together, I'm able to see the contrast, to hear the contrast, because it's very distinct.
Yeah.
The way your family, I think not your and mine, but
Yeah,
since it's examples, how
yeah.
families speak.
Yeah.
And even when we go to the play area or we take Shasa out to some place where there are other parents and say a mother look
Yeah.
at it, "What's wrong with you?" I've heard it a lot.
Yeah, that what's wrong with you?
Yeah, that's just an example, right?
jars
It's very
me so
jarring, yeah.
much.
And I've heard it a lot. So it wasn't a big deal for me because I'm like, yeah, what is wrong with me, right?
Yeah.
But for you, it was a startling thing. Well, how can you say that?
Yeah, and you wouldn't think, and I remember you saying earlier on, you're like, but it's just something I say. I'm like, and it took so many years, I think, for us to, or for you to for me to be conscious of where that's coming from and that it's not really attacking me, but also you realizing why that's jarring. Because according to you, you're like, yeah, what's wrong with you is not something that I really mean. I'm like, yeah, but it still is something that's coming out of your mouth and it's going to affect me, right?
It's also an extension of what we spoke about in the last episode, which is the world we kind of take as our kind of bouncing launch pad from which we enter the world. If that world is filled with conversations of a certain nature and a certain tone, that becomes the normal, or that becomes the default setting with how you speak to people. And if that world is set up a narrative that you speak to certain people in a certain way, that's your close family in a certain way, and you please the world, versus where you are kind to your family but also kind to the world, versus you are extremely kind to your family and you assault the world. There are different situations, right? You've heard all sorts of people, right? They basically will talk to staff in a certain way. They will
Yeah,
talk
gosh.
to people beneath them in a social situation in a certain way. They will suck up to people above them of a social station in a certain way. They will do so many different things, and you've heard them all in different contexts, right? But why are we so stuck in the way we the way we sound? And when I mean the way we sound, is that there is a conscious effort you have to make to break away from that. Whether it's rude, whether it's kind, whether it's to impress, we all have a certain way, and I think that comes from how we were spoken to as kids, and how we witness people around us as kids speaking. And I think that's essential, how our parents interact with each other, how our parents interact with their siblings or their cousins or their friends, and depending on the intimacy of the relationship, right? Like, say, if they go to their best friends, how they would speak, or how they would speak with relatives they like, or how they spoke about relatives they didn't like, or how they spoke to the staff at home. All these things are so powerful because as kids you don't know
And it plays such an important role in
extremely
how you
important. And
think.
I'm bringing this up on today's episode because it's not comfortable for me, because in many ways it's almost like things that I'm not proud of, but it's not something I would define as wrong, is because that was my setting for so many years, right?
Yeah.
And by identifying it as good or bad or right or wrong doesn't allow you to think about it in the right context, because everyone has a default setting, and I think once you become aware of it, it's a great thing.
But I feel like just talking about this, I feel like we have so much pressure now on ourselves, especially because of Shasa, is like Shasa being in the picture. Like we don't want to we're so aware of these things that it's also very difficult to pull away from, right? Like
Yeah, one instance that comes to mind is, I think there was a night where she was going through some sleep cycle, right? You have all the terms for it. I'm not very good with these terms, but sleep regression, I think you called it. And she woke up at like 2 and she was just crying and crying and crying. And I had to catch a flight the next morning at like 5. And I was just, I think, a few drinks down and had gone to bed. And I just woke up angry with her, right? Like going, what the hell's wrong with this child? Like, why was she crying? Like, and it really upset you, rightfully. And in that moment, I just went back to sleep and you handled it. And for the next 2 weeks when I was away, I was just regretting it so much, because I was like, what drove you to speak like that? Because you knew, like the rational part of you knew that she is going through something. She's one, at that point, she was 1.5, maybe not even. And I was like, man. So later we do reflect on what we said and go, oh my God, the rational part of you kicks in and you're the emotional part going. But in that moment, I had no control over it, the way I spoke. And how much ever you are aware of it, it takes so long. And as I said in the last episode, right, like you do certain things. Earlier, you wouldn't just think about it. It would go weeks or months without you understanding. Now, the next minute you're aware. So awareness is maybe sometimes pointless, but I feel it's really helpful, because what took you 1 year to realize now might happen in 6 months, might happen in 1 month. It comes down, the turnaround time for you to work on things.
and I also feel like it's kind of understanding, like we said earlier, or like you said earlier, where each of us have come from such different upbringings, like different with different tones, that finally the person that you end up living with, it's also really difficult, because like for example in our situation, apart from us both having to deal with each other and understand each other at such different levels, it's also the family that you live with, right? So understanding that and kind of blending in with that is a different whole thing altogether. But what I'm trying to say is that it's also okay where anybody is coming from, but how you kind of become aware of each other's situations and work with each other, because you have to be considerate, you have to be emotionally and sensitive about the other person, right? Only then can that relationship be successful and be like not successful but be um,
Can evolve.
can evolve but also be
Devolve also.
huh?
I mean, things have to break down to build up again, right? Because nothing happens in isolation. First of all, if you and I want to work on our tone in the relationship, like if the relationship between you and me has to sound a certain way, which is not beneficial, but which allows for conversation without each of us getting defensive off the bat, it needs to obviously work from each other. But we can't just sit in a cave and say, okay, today, this week, we work on our tone. Because we are
Yeah.
living in a world where there are other people interacting with us. Now, the levels of interaction differ from frequency to intimacy. But it's an ongoing thing. So, like with anything, it may be, right? Whether it's on your relationship kind of goals, if you want to call it, whether it's on how you speak to each other, it's on how you kind of set boundaries. Nothing can happen like in a what's the word, like in a step by step linear way. It happens in an almost cyclical way where there are so many players, whether you like it or not, unless of course you live in a cave in the mountains and you're kind of just working on yourself, which, let's be realistic, many of us aren't doing that, right? And we don't even, I don't even think we can do that. But when the tone is such an important, again I say it because it was such a big part of how I sound on the mic for the public. I'm like, I sounded great on stage, but I come home and I seemed at least in the past to piss you off every night with my tone. So now when I think about the beauty of it, because it's so boring, right? If you only sound angry all the time, no one wants to talk to you. Whether it's your,
Yeah.
your wife or your kid, everyone's like, oh, you just write him off going, that guy's just angry and bitter all the time. But if you can appreciate and kind of work yourself away from, or rather take a step back and listen to what you sound like, it allows for an opportunity where you can say, okay, this was my default setting because I was spoken to as a kid like this by my parents, or I heard them speak like this. You're able to say, okay, this was the tone, this could be optional tones that I use. It gives you so many more different ways to kind of work with. And the biggest thing is, how do you speak to yourself?
Yeah, I think that's where it all stems from, no?
Yeah, if you're angry and you're kind of constantly critical of yourself, which I was and I am to a large extent still, like you're a worthless piece of shit, like you're good for nothing, like again you messed up, again you're a failure, again you're good for nothing. If that's constantly the tone, then the moment your mouth opens, the words come out are going to sound like that.
Yeah.
How much ever your intention is good, but if you change that narrative and that tone to yourself, saying it's okay, man, you messed up. Like when I hit a golf shot, like the things I hit badly all the time. Earlier, I was like, why are you even on the course? Go home. You're blind. You're good for nothing. But now it's like, yeah, you're out here playing. So what?
Yeah.
And it's just those words, because you can't hear yourself in your head. But in that case, the choice of words, it's also like the intention behind those words. If they kind of are less mean, and the viciousness behind is less, you automatically start becoming, you become more able to kind of give more
Yeah.
to people. And that range of tones is so important, especially as a parent, and also as a friend or as a husband, because you're able to be more articulate with the things you want to say when you need to say them. When there is a need to be a little upset, a little angry, a little stern, but also the opportunity to be a little more kind and fun and or
Relaxed.
relaxed is very important, because your child picks up on those things and they know,
Yeah.
okay, that this like facial expressions, right? I don't pick up on much of those, and sometimes you can just automatically tell. And I click, not because we're starting the episode, but I click because you can read a room based on facial expressions. For me, it's tone, and because of someone who pays so much attention to people talking, I'm surprised it took me so long to be aware of tone.
And actually, sometimes when I say something and not even angry or not even anything, but then you feel like hear it as angry because you don't have those other senses of like my facial expression or what I'm doing. Maybe I was on my phone or something like that, and you immediately get angry. And there's no room for like understanding each other in that situation, because you're only going by tone at that point.
And the weirdest thing is people who are most sensitive to a certain thing, sometimes, not everyone, like, you hear things like people who are raised in a certain environment are either averse to it or drawn to it, right? And for me, because I'm so sensitive to sound, it seems like almost I do it without thinking. So, because the moment I hear like a couple fighting or someone being rude to a waiter or someone fighting in the airport, I just tighten up immediately because I receive it. It's almost like this is your cue for threat mode, fight mode, flight mode, right?
I think we all do, though. Like
We all do, yeah.
If there are people fighting, or in fact, I find myself, if people are fighting, kind of trying to step in to be like, diffusing of that fight or something.
I'm
Not fight.
anti-confrontational. I'm anti-confrontational. I, in fact, don't to a point where then I avoid. It builds to such a level, then I go complete aggression. But what I was surprised with is that a person who's so sensitive to especially aggressive tones towards other people, how come I did this for so many years? So I was thinking about it when you brought it up, and first I would be defensive, going, no, you speak like that. Have you heard yourself, And now I realize that there are a lot of these tones being used by people close to me. And I'm not defending them. I'm not defending the way I was in the past, the way I am today. But when that's the tone you hear for years, from a young age especially, like now when I meet people in a social setting, and even for long periods of time, and they speak in a certain way, it doesn't rub off on me.
Yeah.
But the childhood setting, the narrative, the tone, it sticks with you for the longest time. And if it's kind and you're able to kind of express different tones with different people, great. But if you're stuck on one tone, whether it's even too kind, it's a problem, because you're not appreciating the vastness of what you can use, and what's at your disposal, and what potential that tone can sort of help you with,
This is like a solo episode, you know that, no?
It is a solo episode because you clearly have no problem with tone. You're the most amazing, gentle, peacock-like.
I have all the
Is
problem
it peacock-like voice or nightingale-like voice?
Nightingale.
Nightingale.
But I have
You start
all the
singing.
problem with tone.
Yeah. So you should contribute then to this episode.
But I feel like for you right now, like you were just saying, you're so aware now of other people's tones that it's bothering you no end. So like if we go out somewhere and somebody has this tone or whatever, you're like, why is that guy like that? My God, he's always been like that, or something of that sort. And you get so irritated with that particular person. Like, relax. What can you do about it?
The most critical of smokers are the ones who quit. Just like that, right?
Yeah.
So you're kind of, I'm kind of bashing on myself because I know I used to do it and I still do it occasionally, hopefully occasionally. Because it is a problem for me, man, because I get more, it's the energy behind the tone, if you want to talk about that.
Yeah.
And the energy bothers me because that tone doesn't come from someone who's comfortable with themselves.
But then again,
It comes
what
from
can you
insecurity.
do about it?
No, I'm not saying I'm not saying I'm here to. I'm not here to save the world and change people. But there's a big difference from not being aware to being aware.
Yeah.
So I'm in that phase of my life right now.
That
So
awareness phase.
Yeah.
Which is why it feels like a solo episode.
yeah, you can cut that side of it. It's pointless in this episode. Not contributed anything.
Maybe I should be here clapping, like how Shasta says. Papa, clap, Papa.
I'm not clapping anymore after you dissed me on the last episode. No, but for you, because you were spoken to and you heard people speak differently, of course, your parents get angry, your brother and you
And
have fought.
actually,
Yeah.
no, very rare. And when that happened, like if somebody is angry with me for something, whatever it may be, it becomes such a big thing in my head because it's not a normal thing. And it is so impactful. So that's why when I used to hear those things from you so frequently
And flippantly.
and
yeah.
flippantly, it used to hurt me so much that I couldn't function properly. Like I was just kind of being resilient and, you know, going with it, thinking, okay, he doesn't mean it, he doesn't mean it, giving you that benefit of doubt and like saying, okay, he has it difficult, like all of that. But like it's so jarring and it affected me so much that I would then eventually be really angry with you for that. And then I couldn't understand because you would be like, but I didn't even mean it. Why do you feel like you would almost convince me that it's not such a big deal? So then in my head, I'm like second guessing myself. And I'm like, really? Is it that bad? Like, why am I so sensitive? But now I'm like, no.
And then you will go back to Ponyland and
And
realize
then
that,
that it's not okay,
yeah.
that it's not okay. And that's not that it's not okay, but it's not something that I would like.
Yeah. No, and again, these are personal things, right? Like there are situations where a, a certain tone will have certain benefits, right? Because if you want to make a point, if you, this thing, but I've noticed, and this comes from a person who's had an aggressive tone for the longest time, in fact, bordering harsh, and maybe, if you want, whatever word you want to use, not impolite, but kind and actually very polite to the rest of the world,
I know.
to waiters, to drivers,
Anybody
to
else,
the,
friends.
yeah, to everyone. But the meanest son of a bitch when it comes to people at home,
Yeah.
right? There is absolutely no benefit to yourself, firstly, and to the people around you who are close to you, being aggressive 100% of the time or being harsh sounding 100% of the time. It's absolutely pointless. So, you know, it's a little wishy-washy, and I say I take no stance on certain things, but I take a stance on this, saying there's absolutely no benefit living day to day sounding like a complete asshole.
And also, like you're saying, for yourself as well, like
Yeah.
by you being aggressive or you being angry or using that bad tone, you're building yourself up into this bad energy.
And
you
you
feel
are
like,
setting yourself up, and you wonder, right? It's a loop, because you say, why are people talking to me like this? Because you are giving out that kind of tone. People
Yeah.
automatically react to you in that tone. Next thing, it builds up, saying, next time I meet him, yeah.
Yeah, I used to react as well.
Yeah.
With a bad tone, because I'm like, okay, if I'm being spoken to like that, I'll also.
And then instead of me diffusing it or breaking down that resistance, wait a second, did I say something to provoke this reaction? I'm like, I'll show her, you know?
Yeah, and then it'll just
heightens.
spiral. Oh my
Yeah.
gosh. Thank God we're kind of over that. But let's talk about it from social media and people who feel like,
I mean, think
like
about it now.
activists and all of that. Like I'm feeling, I'll tell you what I'm feeling.
Yeah, please do.
At Ikiwi, we are a sustainable and ethical platform, and it's something that's really, really close to me in terms of fashion and what goes on behind the scenes and who these people are who are making our clothes and why their lives are as important as ours and why we should make a change in this fashion world, because fast fashion and fast fashion companies are really ill-treating their employees as well as the environment and all of that. So I'm in that space of activism in that sense. And there are some people who are able to educate and bring out a point of why certain things need to change, right? Like why are certain things bad and what needs to change. But there are some really aggressive activists that I'm not sure if that makes, again with tone, right? I'm not sure if that's benefiting us as a society or benefiting us in the industry, because I feel like it's so aggressive and you're pinpointing fingers at people for doing things badly. How is that progress? Like, how are we going to make any changes? So, according to me, I feel like we need to be more gentle about it and supportive about it and be like, okay, this is like, lay it all out and let people take those decisions. Because if you lay it out and say, okay, these are the number of people who are not treated fairly and are ill treated, will a person really make a choice against that? Like, yes, of course, our, governments and all of that, like, we can't even get into that, but like everyday consumers, isn't that a better way of making change and creating change as opposed to being angry and aggressive?
Absolutely. I mean, if you look at leaders, the good leaders aren't the ones who just keep shouting all the time at the people there who are following them, right? Again, it's the, I wouldn't say the diversity, but it's the ability to kind of modulate your tone and while trying to make a point. And the more, I mean, this is, I've read in across books across the years, whether it's generals in the Roman army to um, Navy SEAL commanders, whoever it may be, the idea of uh, being a good orator is, is being able to use the right tone for the right situation, for the right message. Now, when you're accusatory, like as you said with the activists, people write you off after a point. They're like, you know what, whatever I do, this person is going to accuse me of a thing, a wrong they see me committing. And there's no one, there's no, and you've noticed this, there's no scope for discourse then. There's no scope for back and forth, because then you kind of provoke that reaction to get in that other person. When you accuse them, you're on the back foot, or they're on the back foot, they're going to come back fighting.
Yeah.
And you don't want to constantly just fight your point if no one's going to listen, or if you're going to just put someone else down, right?
Yeah.
So in every situation now, if you look in the world, right, whether it's politics, whether it's economics, it's always like, oh, and it's the activists don't, whether it's transgender, whether it's climate change, the reason why there's nothing being done is because everyone's just yelling at everyone. And there's no one saying, you know what, let's stay quiet and listen to the other side. And that's no, I'm not saying it's that simple, but it's one of the biggest problems.
Yeah. I think from like at the same time, like contradicting exactly what I just said, but there are people like Greta Thunberg, for example, who have to be that extreme, on that extreme side of the scale, so that it's kind of talked about a lot more, and there's a lot more attention being given to something that she's standing up for, because then whoever's the higher ups are like, okay, there's pressure on us because the whole world is kind of supporting and following somebody like a Greta Thunberg.
And that's the sad thing in our society. On social media, only the people who shout are being heard. But for every Greta Thunberg, there are actually people doing work on the ground quietly. And they're actually getting more stuff done. They're saving more animals, they're saving more species, they're saving more environments. But clearly the likes of Greta Thunberg get noticed because they're obnoxious.
No, but maybe we need them all, like different kinds of people supporting the same thing, so that we can.
No, but there are
actually
people
make
doing
that.
it, right? We don't see the millionaires who are actually giving up their money to save tribes, to save people who are at high risk. We, unfortunately, social media picks up these people who are noisy, whether it's the noisy billionaires who are doing illegal trade or human trafficking, or it's the noisy activists who are going and chaining themselves to priceless paintings. It's the quiet ones who are getting the work done, but social media doesn't have time for them because they're not noisy enough. So I'm not saying it's right or wrong again, but I think in some way there are good people doing great work, and there are great people doing really rubbish work. But what is the distinction is that the medium that picks up on them wants noise.
Yeah.
It doesn't want silence. Imagine someone who's going and restoring beaches in the western coast of India, doing it quietly. No one cares about them. They want the people who are actually going and chaining themselves up to parliament and spitting in politicians' faces. You want that kind of stuff, because that's the society we live in. But coming down to that, like if Greta Thunberg could actually sit, I mean, she's a child, right?
Now she's not anymore.
I mean, she's a child.
She's grown up.
I mean, age-wise.
Yeah.
But honestly,
I
if
mean,
she
you don't
had
know her personally.
I don't know her personally,
Then
but
don't judge.
I'm not judging. Of course, I'm judging, but from the work she's put out there, her work is noisy. But if she had
But
the
at least we
maturity that
know-
comes with age, if she can sit down, I think that might even give a much deeper side to her, which might have more impact for her work. But if you're just yelling, going to restaurants, and like they had someone recently at the PGA Golf Championship trying to come and set up flares on the green. I'm like, yeah, you're disrupting stuff, but do you want to just disrupt stuff under the guise of, ban fossil fuels? But let's be realistic, fossil fuels aren't going anywhere. And let's not go into that because it's an entire conversation for the experts. And that's something we need to talk about, the experts versus the influencers. And I think we'll talk about it in the next episode or episodes to come. But I think closing thoughts on this is, why don't you go first?
I think closing thoughts is that tone is very, very important, because we live in a society and we do interact with people and other people. If we live in a society, we need to be aware of something like that, because it does affect people both positively and negatively. So I feel like tone is very, very important.
Great closing arguments. And I think that's something which I'm working on. It's again work in progress, but just being aware of what your default setting is, your factory settings are, and then automatically realize how the people you grew up with speak. And again, this is with as little judgment as possible. It's very difficult in a situation not to judge. But just for yourself, if you can change your tone with yourself, I think it's a great beginning for a path which you can head down. And you start becoming aware of other people's tones, right? And then you realize that how much you can get done with the right tone at the right time. And if nothing else
they
works,
say-
listen to tones and I.
Oh gosh. They say talk to yourself like you talk to your best friend.
Yeah.
They say that.
Do they?
Yeah, they as in I don't know who.
Yeah,
This
this they is our collective expert. It's sitting in the cloud.
for all of us. But anyway, they
They.
do say that. People say that, and it makes sense.
But
And
now
I
they is
think
an individual.
whatever. So like, I think we should definitely consciously do more of that, and
Yeah.
we'll just be so much happier.
Yeah, I think with everything, if you can start the experiment or start the conversation or start the work with yourself and just look within, it's not that easy. But if you can start there, I think you've already made huge discovery and a huge step in the right direction.
So, what are your thoughts
I
on
just said it.
tone? Not yours.
Oh, you got to tell. I can't see where you're looking. I thought there's some other person in the room.
Oh gosh.
Yeah.
So thank you so much everybody for listening to this episode. If you've reached the end, thank you. Even if you haven't, thank you. And
If they haven't reached the end, how will they hear your thank you? That was perfect tone, perfect time.
thank you everybody. We'd love for you to share this episode with anyone you think who may be interested.
Thank you.